crafty friends, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. Today I'm diving into the brand new Tim Holtz Sizzix Halloween 2025 release, featuring the return of 6 classic die sets and 2 newly resized A5 embossing folders. I'll give you a quick peek at everything in the release, and then I'll walk you through how I created this grungy Halloween card using some wickedly fun mixed media techniques. We'll play with distressed spray stains, distressed oxide sprays, crackle paste, and more. And I'll even share a few tips for adding machine stitching for extra texture. Whether you're crafting for Halloween or just love layering and grunge, these techniques work for any theme or season. Now let's get into it. So to get started, I'm going to be working with one of the new dies from the Tim Holtz Sizzix Halloween 2025 release, and for this release Tim has gone back to the vault in a slightly different way. There's a set of dies that are re-releases of the original dies, so these have not been resized. They're exactly the same as the original dies. So if you have the originals, you are definitely not going to need anything new. But if you, like me, missed out when these were first released, or maybe you weren't a Tim Holtz fan at the time. I wasn't quite as into Tim Holtz back in the day. So this new release is perfect for those of us that missed out on these and have always wanted to add some of them to our collection. So here's a look at the die sets. First up is Witchcraft. This is definitely one of my favorites, and I was so excited to see this one released so that I could have it for my stash. Next up is an alphabet set called Cutout. Got leaf fragments, layered jack-o'-lantern, trick or treat, and haunted house. He is also releasing 2 new embossing folders in the A5 size, and first up is Foliage, and then the other one is Cracked. So these are just larger folders from the original of these two. So this is the size of the original Cracked, and there is the size of the new large A5 size. And then the same thing with the Foliage. So if you'd like to see a little more inspiration using these larger A5 embossing folders, I'll put a link to a video here and in the description box that shares a little more insight into these larger folders and gives you some ideas on how you can use them despite the larger size. The supplies I'm going to be working with for this card include this crest stencil from Mini Set 53 from Tim Holtz, the Witchcraft die set from Tim Holtz and Sizzix, and then several Halloween stamp sets. So I've got Life of the Party, and I'm using this one for the sentiment, so of course you could switch that out. I'm going to be using Unraveled and also Exquisite. And for Exquisite, I'm just using this text image, so you could certainly switch that out for any kind of a text image. And on this one, I'm using the bats and the spider webs. The papers I'm going to be working with are the Tim Holtz Blackout Craft Stock. This is just a black craft stock printed with a black texture on one side. So this is the textured black craft stock, not the smooth one. I'm not sure if this is still out there and available, but there is a smooth black craft stock in the paper packs that he has. Then I also have this mixed media heavyweight paper from scrapbook.com, and then I'm going to be using my favorite always, distressed watercolor cardstock for the background. And the mediums I'm going to be working with is Distress ink and ground espresso. I'm going to have some archival ink here in vintage photo and black soot. Got a distress crayon and walnut stain. I'm going to be using some spray stains in antique linen and hickory smoke, and then a distress oxide and rusty hinge. Also going to be using some Crackle Paste opaque, and then some white embossing powder and an embossing ink. So as far as any substitutions, you could always switch up and use different colors. You just need some sort of permanent waterproof ink for the stamping that we're going to be doing. And then, of course, if you want to switch out and just do all spray stains or oxide sprays or other sprays that you might have, feel free to switch those out as well. Now let's get into it. So to get started, I've cut a piece of distressed watercolor cardstock down to 4 1/4 by 6 inches. And I'm working in my splat box. I've got some paper towels down just to absorb any extra ink that might get on there. And I'm going to be working with some distressed spray stain in antique linen and hickory smoke. You could certainly switch out and use the oxides with this if you would like. So I'm just going to kind of get some color going on here and spray them a little bit here and there. I'm going to use a little bit of water, kind of get those colors mixing and flowing together a little bit. And a little kind of color overlap as well, spritzing that. And yeah, so you can see where it's kind of like speckledy here and there. If you want to leave it like that, you can. So just like use a little less water. And then you can just kind of tap and make that ink run. Now, if you want this to be more solid and get rid of those little speckledy bits, just add a little more water. It's kind of a personal preference on the look there. And then now we're going to take our heat tool and dry this. And I kind of like to tilt it and kind of dab off some of that excess ink while I'm drying. That just kind of gets those colors moving and flowing. But then by tipping it, and then you can kind of dab it off on the paper towel, you can kind of get rid of those harsh edges. So like if you left that to dry, it would just look like that when it was dry. But if you kind of tap it off on the paper towel, then it removes that and gives you a more smooth edge. So now we're going to do a little bit of stamping, and I'm going to take the script image from the Exquisite stamp set, but you could use any script image you like. And then I've got the Vintage Photo Archival ink. I'm just going to rub it over the surface. I'm not tapping it down. I don't want like a ton of ink on here. I find that the rubbing gives it a little bit lighter coverage. And then I'm just going to stamp using my fingers to kind of press that image down here and there onto the background. So I'm not going for complete coverage of the image or perfect stamping or anything like that. And if you feel like you need a little bit more ink, just give it another rub over, and then you can continue doing the stamping here and there. And I just kind of love the imperfect bit you get with this. So there we are. And then next we're going to add some stamping using the bat image from the Unraveled stamp set. And again, just going to rub over this. So again, not going for like real dark impression, just a little bit of interest. So I'm going to stamp this kind of in this upper corner here. And if this makes you completely freak out, you can certainly use a stamping block if that makes you a little more comfortable. But I just want a light coverage of the image, so I think my main focal point is going to cover up some of that. So now I'm just going to, well, let's be smart. How about we take a little bit of that paper towel and cover up anywhere where I don't want the stamp. Just kind of stamp there. There we go. There we are. Perfect. All right. At least that's kind of what I was going for there. So if you want a darker image there with the stamping, just use the stamping block. That will give you more color. And then, of course, I was rubbing this on, but if you tap it on and really get good ink coverage, that's also going to get more ink onto the stamp and give you a more solid image. All right, so now the next step we want to do, we want to make sure that everything is dry. So we're going to dry this really good with our heat tool, or you need to just let it sit to the side for a little while just to make sure everything's super dry. And the reason being is we're going to be doing some heat embossing, and the powder will stick to anything that is wet. So even the archival ink will hold the embossing powder if it's not completely dry. So just something to keep in mind there. Now for this part, I am going to work on my stamping platform, and because I do want to make sure I get a good impression. So we've got some of the spider web images from the Unraveled stamp set, and again, just gonna, you can use any spider web images. Tim's got quite a few sets with spider web, so you can easily use any of them that you might have. And we're just going to ink that up with some embossing ink. I'm going to put a piece of printer paper underneath to catch the embossing powder, and then I'm just going to pour the embossing powder over the top of this, and this is just regular white embossing powder. But you can see it sticks to areas if it's still wet, even just a little bit, it'll stick. You think stuff's dry, and you do this and you'll find out, nope, it is not. So if you do have that happen where it sticks into some areas, just grab a little paintbrush and just brush that away. But it's also not the end of the world if you miss some spots, because it can just kind of add to the distressed effect with those little speckles here and there. And then we'll just dump this back into the jar. You want to let your heat gun warm up for 10 or 15 seconds and then move it over the surface kind of slowly and keeping it a few inches back so that you don't accidentally burn the paper or anything. And then obviously if your hands are sensitive, make sure you're not getting the heat gun on your fingers or using some tweezers or something to hold it so that your hand doesn't get too hot. So there is a look at where we are so far. So when you're doing the heat embossing, you'll notice the powder is kind of dull, and then as it's getting heated, it will begin to melt and it'll become shiny. And so that when it starts turning shiny, that's your cue to kind of move on to the next section, so that you just kind of keep that heat gun moving over the surface until everything is melted and shiny. And if you think you missed any spots, just go back and heat over them again if you need to. So now we're going to do some stenciling, and I'm working on the scrapbook.com grip mate just to help hold the paper and the stencil in place here. And then I'm just going to kind of play around with where I want to position the stencil. And I know I'm going to be working with the Witchcraft die set, and that's going to kind of be my focal point here. So you can use that, cut out one and just kind of use that as a guide to figure out where to place things. That also would give you an idea of like where you maybe would want to do your spiderweb stamping or any other kind of imaging. That's also what I was using to help me kind of figure out, like I said, with the bats, like those were going to be covered up in the middle, but then there's some bats here and there behind it. So like I said, you can kind of play around with that to use for helping where to do your stencil work. Just push that down there. And then for this, I'm going to be using the Crackle Paste Opaque. So I'm just going to scoop a little bit of that up onto my palette knife here and just apply that kind of liberally over the surface here. Kind of want to get that, most of that design. Some of this isn't going to show up underneath, but go ahead and give it an application there, and then just kind of make sure it's not too thick. You don't want to have it on so thick that you can't see the stencil. And then Just very gently lift that up. I noticed a little seepage under there. It's not the end of the world. Smeared it a little bit there, but some of that will be covered. And it, again, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's going to be added to, just kind of adds to the distressed effect. And I want to repeat that image over on this side, so I'm going to clean off my stencil and come back and stencil over here. All right, so now I am back with my clean stencil. And again, you can kind of use your die cut to kind of figure out where you might want to position that stencil and scoot it over just a tiny bit more. So I'm going to just kind of position it about there. And I'll add a little bit more of the paste. And my paste is pretty fluid right now, so I think that's probably why it kind of went under the stencil. It's almost too wet. So I'm just kind of hold it down. If it's popping up a little bit in any places, you can kind of use your finger and then just gently apply it over the stencil. And then again, you just want to gently lift that up to reveal the design. And then again, get this into some water or clean it. And then if you are working on the grip mate, you can just clean that off as well in the sink, or spritz it with some water and use your palette knife to kind of remove off some of that excess, and then clean it off with a lint-free rag. And then as far as your background, at this point, you're going to want to set this to the side and just let it air dry. The trick with the Crackle Paste is you want to let it air dry. You can't speed this up. If you try to speed it up, the paste won't crackle and give you that really cool effect that you're going for with using the Crackle Paste. Here's just a real up close where you can just see that it's just starting to crackle. And that's going to be starting on the areas that are a little thinner, because they're drying a little faster. And here's a little more progress with the crackle as it's drying, but it's still not completely dry. And the way you can kind of tell is if you feel the back of the paper and the paper still feels moist, then the Crackle Paste is not dry. So just continue to let it keep drying. So here is a look at the fully cracked and dried paper. And now we're ready for the final steps. So to add a little more grungy interest to this, I'm going to take some of the Distress Oxide Spray and Rusty Hinge, and I'm going to paint it onto the background. So I'm just going to put some of it here onto my craft mat. And then I'm going to just use a brush to just kind of apply a little bit of it here and there to my background. You can also add a little bit of water if you want, just to kind of add to the ability to kind of spread it around. And just kind of haphazardly kind of adding it here and there. Get some down around in this edge here. Kind of like adding kind of like a little bit of a rusty effect here with this. If you want to add a little spritzing of some water there, you can. And then we're going to give that a dry. And I know it doesn't look like much at this point. In fact, you're kind of like, probably like, oh my, what have you done? Bear with me. We're not finished yet. And then once that's dry, you're going to take the Distress ink, ground espresso, and we're just going to ink around the edges here. And so I'm going to just kind of rub it around on my craft mat, get it moving a little bit, and then just pull that ink around the edges here of the background. And then to add a little more grunge here, I'm just going to take a walnut stain distress crayon, kind of color over some of the crackle paste areas. And if you want to use your finger to rub that around, you can, or you can take a little brush. Just kind of blend that in here and there. A little bit of water, if need be, to kind of help move it around a little bit as well. In fact, I'm kind of liking using my finger a little better than the brush even. So kind of rub that around here. Get a little more spritz there. And then as you can see, that kind of colors the paste a little bit and gives it a little more grungy effect as well. And that paste is not quite so bright white anymore. Yeah, so you can kind of keep going with that until you're happy with how it looks. Now I'm just going to add some more water splatters using the distress sprayer. And here I'm going to kind of dribble like larger droplets and really let that kind of do its magic with the various layers that we've added of the sprays and the ink and the oxide. And then you can just kind of let that sit to dry, or you can use your heat tool and speed up the drying process if you like. You know, and if you got some areas where you're not like totally loving what's going on, you can always go back in and add a little more interest to things. And of course, my favorite, finger painting always. All right, so now let's give that a little dry. And you can always just kind of tap off, like if you got a little extra, more than maybe you want of something there going on, just grab a little rag and paper towel and give it a dry. Want a little more water somewhere, you can always add more. And once that's dry, I sometimes like to go back in with my ink and re-ink the edges a little bit, but this time I'm kind of holding it, and that way I'm kind of getting a really nice dark edge to the paper, which I always think just kind of adds a nice little frame to things. Kind of dabbing a little bit over the paste areas just to give that a little bit darker effect. And it looks like your spider webs have been a little color over them. They're not as bright white. You can just wipe over them with some damp cloth and water. So the final step here on the background is to just add some machine stitching around the outer edge of the paper. I often get people asking me about sewing on paper, and while I can't go over machines and how to thread machines and all that kind of stuff, I just thought I would share with you how I do it. I have a special needle like that I just use for sewing. It's not anything special in the sense of like a special kind of needle, but I just have one that I set aside just to use with paper because the paper will dull the needle. And then, yeah, if you've ever done any sewing, it's really just the same as what you would do when you're sewing fabric. So you're just, place the paper under the sewing foot and, line it up on the measurement guides on the machine so you can decide, how far from the edge you want to add the stitching. You can select whatever kind of stitch you want to use. I'm just going to do a regular running stitch, and then just start sewing. So it's really that simple. When you get to the corner, I like to leave the needle down in the paper and then rotate it so it can kind of get a little bit more of a nice square corner. Now obviously, if you want more of a distressed type stitching that's less perfect, you know, you can move the paper and make the stitching less straight. So if you want something kind of more wonky. And here I am just coming back around to where I started. And then this is where, you know, you can, when you remove the needle, and then I just like to leave like those little tails on there, and that just adds some interest to the card with a little bit of texture. And then if you want to add more of that somewhere, what you can do then is just leave your little tails on there, and then just add like a little bit more of stitching over on another side. And then leave the tails, and then just repeat that a few places if you want. And there you have it. So as you can see, you can sew through the paste. That's not going to hurt anything. I've sewn through all kinds of things that maybe aren't things you should sew through, but the needle will go through, you know, various types of papers, chipboard, as long as it's thin, or chipboard, and thicker papers, it'll go through them. Safety first when it comes to sewing and everything. So if it's not something that you're comfortable with or you do very often, you know, you might want to do a little bit more research and like learning how to sew, because it's obviously not exactly what I'm teaching here, but just wanted to show this with you and share that step. So for the main embellishment on the card, I die cut the witch from the Witchcraft die set from some black craft stock. Now this is the one that has some texture to it. There's also one that's solid. If you have some of that, that would work as well. And then I also cut it from a piece of scrapbook.com's mixed media paper, because it's just, that paper is just so super thick, and this paper is a little bit on the thinner side. So I'm going to adhere these two layers together with some liquid adhesive just to help give this a little bit more stability. When you're adhering pieces together that kind of have these thinner areas, you don't have to glue everything down exactly perfect, but you can also just put some on your craft mat, and if you want to take your finger or a brush and just kind of wipe that over the surface there to kind of get a good coverage, especially of those little thinner areas. And then you can go back in and add some more as needed, but get it around the edges here. And I'm just going to kind of rub some of that around on the face there to get that good coverage. And then wipe the glue off your fingers so that you don't get it on the die cut like I just did there, but we'll fix that here in a second. And then just adhere these layers together. And then once you've got everything lined up, if you want to use like a acrylic block or something to lay on top of this to help just kind of hold it in place while it dries, you can, but it'll dry pretty quickly with the liquid adhesive. And then to give this a little bit more of a distressed effect, what you can do is take your die cut, kind of place it back into the negative, just to kind of help hold it in place. And then if you want, you could also put a little bit of mint tape on the back side, especially for these areas where it might, move around a little bit on you, or especially the broom, because it's very delicate there. And then I'm going to take a sanding disc and just lightly sand over the image. So if you did get some spots where you had glue on your fingers, this is a way to remove that while giving your die cut a really cool aged and kind of grungy effect. I still like to hold the die just to be on the safe side so that it doesn't pop out on me. And then having that second double layer of cardstock, it kind of pops it up and really lets me get to the edges for the sanding and add to that effect. And then if you want to add a little bit of that distress through the middle here, just kind of rub it around here and there until you are happy with how it looks. And then as far as this real detailed part, I'm holding it here and then kind of sanding away from my fingers so that it's kind of protected and not likely to tear. And once that's all done, you can just take a little lint-free rag and wipe away the dust. And then your die cut is ready to go for your card. And then to finish off the card, you can just stamp a sentiment. I'm using one of the sentiments from Life of the Party, but obviously there's lots of sentiments out there from Tim's Halloween sets that could work for this, or maybe you've got some other ones. And then I'm just going to stamp that on some white cardstock using some black soot archival ink. And then I'm going to trim that down just to a little strip and ink the edges with some ground espresso distress ink. And the final step is to take a piece of white cardstock, cut to 4.5 by 6.25 inches, and then just ink the edges with that leftover ground espresso ink that you might have on there. And you can do as much or as little of this as you like, and then you're just going to layer these together using some adhesive, whatever your favorite adhesive might be. If you want to pop this up a little bit more, you certainly could, but with that really delicate little broom piece, it would be hard to use any kind of foam tape. So if you want it more dimensional, I would cut another layer or two of this image from some more black cardstock and adhere them together, and then that'll give you a little bit more dimension. And then you can adhere this sentiment strip with a little bit of foam tape for some dimension. Thanks so much for watching. If you're as excited about this Halloween release as I am, let me know which die set is your favorite down in the comments. And remember, these mixed media techniques aren't just for spooky season. Try them with florals, winter scenes, or whatever inspires you. You'll find links to all the products I used in the description box below, along with the visual supply list if you want a quick look at everything. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you gave it a thumbs up and subscribe for more crafty inspiration, tips, and techniques. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay crafty, my friend.